I've been knitting for just under 10 years, but it's only been in the past 2 years or so that I've really started to hone in on my knitting skills and make garments. And honestly, once I've started to make real clothing like socks and sweaters and all that good stuff, there has been no turning back. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to start knitting in 2022. This will be a video in a couple parts. What you're going to learn in this video is a little bit about the basics, how to choose yarn, the different types of yarn, the different types of needles, and how to just essentially, if you are starting from the very beginning, giving you some tips on what you need to know to get going. Now, before we do get into it, if you are not yet subscribed, I would really love if you hit the subscribe button. This is a place where I talk about making my own clothes, and I let you in on how you can do that too. Now, let us get into the video so we can talk about everything that you need to know to start knitting in 2022. Now, let's get into the things that you need to have, because like all hobbies, especially within the fiber arts, there are some tools. Luckily, knitting doesn't have all that many for you to kind of get started off the gate. It's good to have, obviously, a pair of knitting needles, but you only need one pair of knitting needles to get started. You don't need to have a whole range of sizes. Just get the size for the project that you're working on. You will also need some yarn, of course, and you'll need a embroidery needle for tucking in those loose ends at the end of your project. Some nice to haves, and I say nice to have because they aren't entirely necessary right off the bat, but they may come in handy down the line. Some of my nice to haves include a tape measure, stitch markers, wool wash for washing and blocking your work, but we will get into that another time. Interchangeable needles are a go-to for me, but again, not necessary right away. A project bag to keep your ongoing work in so that it doesn't get all tangled in things or your pet gets into it or, whatever. Now let's get into the fun part, or at least my favorite part, yarn. Shopping for yarn is honestly a delight, and a lot of knitters will say that collecting yarn, similarly to how sewists, collect fabric, they will say that it's a hobby in and of itself. And it definitely can be, especially once you get into kind of the indie brands and all the deep knowledge and all that good stuff. But that's not what this video is going to cover. We're just going to go over the very basics. There are three main types of fibers that we're going to be talking about for this video. Those are natural, synthetic, and blends. Natural yarns are either from animals or from plants. So plant-based fibers include cotton, tencel, bamboo, and then you can get into the animal fibers, which are wool, merino, angora, mohair, llama, camel. There's a whole bunch. For synthetic fibers, you will probably hear about things like acrylic, nylon, and polyamide. The third category are blends. So that's taking any of the above that we talked about and mixing them together. So for sock yarn, you might often see a mix of merino and nylon or wool and nylon because the nylon gives it some strength. For mohair, you might see silk mohair, so silk and mohair combined, maybe with a little bit of nylon in there as well. You'll often see wool and acrylic. There are also different weights of yarn: lace, fingering, sport, DK, worsted, Aran, bulky, chunky, extra chunky, or extra bulky. They all kind of have some varying names, and some of them can be grouped into categories. But in this chart that I have up on the screen, you'll see these numbers, and these numbers are always going to be classified with a certain weight of yarn. So 4 will almost always be worsted or Aran weight. So this is really helpful when you are starting to pick out what kind of yarn you want, because you're going to be looking at a pattern that is going to tell you what kind of yarn. And when you go to the store, you're going to be looking for those corresponding numbers in the store. Now that's a whole lot of information. So let us talk about how you actually get to picking a yarn, whether that's through, the weight or the fiber. When it actually comes down to it, well, how do you buy yarn in the store or online? There's a few different ways to answer this question, but I'm going to answer it based on what I think would be best for a beginner. And you can probably hear different things from different people, but honestly, this is just my take. For me, I would say start with a project. Before you buy anything, start with something that you want to make. I would say you should have pretty minimal things that you need to learn. So probably just sticking with knitting and purling and maybe having some increases. But the most easiest things to make would be a hat or a scarf. A hat being maybe slightly more challenging in that, it's not just a long rectangle that goes on for ages. But finding the pattern first and then starting to build your materials based on that is, in my opinion, the best way to go about it, because it gives you a goal. If you see a pattern that you really love and you buy the yarn that you think will be really like a really good match for it, then you're going to be motivated because you want the end product. If you are just learning how to knit and you don't really have a goal in mind, it's going to be really easy to drop off that skill because it's going to feel overwhelming and you're going to wonder why you're even doing it. So I recommend starting with a project, and we will get into the projects in the next video. But for this video, we're just going to talk about the process. So you're going to want to pick a project and build out from there. The nice thing about working with patterns is that they really kind of tell you everything that you need. They're like a recipe. So the pattern designer will tell you what needles you need. They will tell you what type of yarn you need, and they'll tell you, what weight it should be. So they'll say that they used, 100% wool in a worsted weight. And you can go to the store and, go to your yarn store, your craft store, and look for 100% wool worsted weight. And that should give you or get you as close as possible, to the pattern. They will also ask you to make a swatch. That's really a whole other thing we'll get into in the next video. All that's to say, when starting out, I do recommend sticking as close to the pattern recommendations as you possibly can. It will lead you in the right direction, I promise. Personally, I do like to try to use the yarn that the pattern designer has used because I know I'm more than likely going to get the similar gauge to them. But that said, that's not always doable, and sometimes they use really expensive yarns. So there's a few options here. You can go onto Google and look for a yarn substitute. So you can type in yarn sub and then like the name of the yarn that they're using, and then you can try to find a match based on that. Another cool tip is Ravelry, and I mentioned Ravelry at the beginning of this video. It's a knitting social media website, but it is a huge hub and resource for knitters. There's tons of patterns, tons of yarn recommendations, and once you start to get used to it, it becomes a really good tool. But the fun thing is, if you go to Ravelry and you find a pattern on Ravelry, there will be a little section called Yarn Ideas. And you can click into that and you can see what yarns other people have used for that exact same project. So it takes a little bit of the guesswork out of it. You can go into each of the little the yarns and you can see what people have used. You can also pull up their projects and see their commentary about the yarn, how they felt about it, all of that stuff. In terms of fiber, you don't have to use the fiber that the designer used. If it's a animal-based wool and you don't want to use an animal-based yarn, then you can use something like cotton or a cotton blend with tencel, bamboo. There's a variety of other yarns that you can use. Or if you know that you have a sensitivity to mohair or a sensitivity to wool, you can also, like I said, use the Ravelry or yarn substitute resources to find an alternative yarn. What you will want to keep in mind though is that even if you are changing the fibers, you're not using wool, you're using cotton, for example, you will still want to use the same weight. So you will still want to use a worsted yarn and you will want to use the same needles that they recommend. As you get more comfortable with knitting and more comfortable with this process, then you're going to start to play around with needle sizes, and that's where you'll learn more about different gauges and holding yarns together and all that stuff. But for the sake of being a very beginner, I recommend just kind of following the instructions as closely as possible. And then from there, once you start to get comfy, you can kind of build out your skills a bit more. Now going on to how to pick a project. How do you decide on what is a good project for a beginner? I think that this is really important. And like I said, the thing that I will always recommend to beginners is to pick a project that you really want to make. If it's a sweater and you've never knitted before, but you really want to make this sweater and the pattern designer has said that it can be for very beginners, then you should absolutely knit the sweater. It might take you long and it might, be really frustrating, but if it's something that you really want to do, then you should definitely do it, because that is going to be way more inspiring than just knitting an endless, scarf that goes on forever and is, not really that inspiring. Scarves are great, and there are a ton of free patterns online for scarves as well, and they definitely do help you get into that rhythm, especially if you're knitting quite a long and chunky scarf. But I would definitely say go with something that sparks joy, that feels good, that you're excited about, and that is 100% the way to begin. A good place to get started with looking for patterns or looking for a project is on Ravelry. I'll walk you through how to do that. So first, you're going to make an account. And then once you have an account, you're going to go into the Patterns tab on the Ravelry homepage. Once you're in the Pattern tab, you're going to personalize, so you can pick knit and crochet, crochet, or knitting. I have knitting selected because that's my preference. Then you can scroll down and start to customize your search. So here they have a bunch of categories, and I'm going to go to sweater. Once you're in the sweater category, you can start to narrow it down even further. So you can go to cardigan or pullover or other. I'm going to go to pullover, and then I'm going to use the advanced search, and I'm going to start to narrow down. So I'm going to put it that I'm looking for an adult pattern. I'm going to put that I am looking for knitting. There it is. I'm going to say that I want a free pattern. I also really recommend going under the difficulty and selecting maybe piece of cake, easy, and 3. There we go. And then you essentially start your scroll. You look at the patterns available. These are all free patterns, and you go into them and you start to decide, if that's the pattern that you want to do. And you look at the different categories, you pull them up, and you start to take a look at, the description, the yarn, the reviews. So you can go into the projects and see what people have said about that project. You can go into that yarn ideas tab and see what people have used for this project. You can go into the project tab and see people's finished products, or at least see their commentary. There's a whole lot of resources available for you on Ravelry, and I would say it's a really great tool for beginner knitters. That's going to be it for this video. We're going to leave it here. I didn't want to get too deep into it, but I did want to give you a place to start before you get into the actual nitty gritty, there's a pun in there, of learning how to knit. In the next video, we're going to get into specific stitches. So we're going to talk about knit, purl, ribbing. We're going to talk about gauge, like I mentioned, just a little tiny bit of. We'll get more into different projects, and we'll talk about some of the lingo. So that's going to be it for today. Thank you so much for being here. If you like this video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. If you have any questions or anything that you want to see specifically in that next video or within this little series, please let me know. I would love to hear what you have to say, and I can't wait to see you again next time. Thank you so much. Bye.